And finally, something has to be said about the games that just give us new experiences we can't get anywhere else. Games that are so good on that first playthrough, not mainly because of a compelling narrative, a breathtaking world, or some insane twist, but because they offer something unlike anything else out there. Something that either challenges us and makes us think, or provides entirely new ways to play or experiences that differ from games before, or just a refinement in a way that makes the gameplay hit home. Games that focus on being a breath of fresh air and something that will last with us for a long time. Games like It Takes Two. Nowadays, it feels like there's so many co-op games out there you can play with others. Diablo, Remnant, Portal, Overcooked, and so many others. But none quite capture the magic of what playing with another person should really be like It Takes Two, the greatest co-op game ever made. And the reason that is because It Takes Two is not only an amazing game, but was built from the ground up to be everything that we love about co-op. You play as May and Cody, a married couple who have suddenly been transferred into some of their daughter's dolls, and must fight their way back out into their original bodies, all while going on crazy adventures around a house as tiny people. What sounds like a fairly mundane romp, though, is anything but, because throughout It Takes Two's fairly long runtime, especially for a co-op game, you will find yourself in massive tree lines, inside beehives, and even inside grandfather clocks that lead to some of the most impressive and distinct levels in a game I've ever seen. The real enchantment, though, comes from the gameplay, where you will at all times not only see your screen, but also the screen of the person you're playing with. And this is critical because the entire game is built around this mechanic, where you will constantly be screaming at each other and laughing as you have to figure out each puzzle or boss encounter, each of which has the perfect amount of challenge to remain interesting without taking away the fun. And speaking of fun, the game is constantly switching things up, moving from one style to another over and over, and every time a new mechanic is introduced, it only sticks around for max an hour, and by the time it's starting to feel old, something entirely new is already happening. There are music levels, Mortal Kombat style encounters, tons of different types of platforming, underwater levels that are some of the best ever, flying, diving, running, anything and everything that could happen does. And it just makes the entire experience such an amazing one to have, especially for the first time with a friend sitting on the same couch as it unravels in front of both of you. As someone who is obviously personally so passionate about games myself, I tend to like almost anything as long as it's made well and with passion behind it. But It Takes Two is one of those few games I can show almost anyone, even my friends who hate games, and they will instantly fall in love and play for hours on end. One of those experiences, especially on the first playthrough, that shows just how far games have come and is a great example of why I always say games are better nowadays, and that despite undying nostalgia, the best is yet to come. Wasteland 3 has got to be one of the most underrated games out there. It's a series that could capture the hearts and minds of a mainstream audience, just like Fallout, but because of the genre and time in which it was released, never quite had the explosion I think it deserves. And that's because your first playthrough of this game will be one full of hysterical, heartfelt, and just downright insane moments alike, taking place in a wasteland almost too familiar to Fallout, which makes sense since Fallout was actually based on the original Wasteland. In the third installment, you get to build a ragtag group together as you take on robots, bandits, and psychos alike. The real charm of the game, though, comes from its writing and world. It feels like everywhere you go, there's some zany and out there little side story about a talking dog that is a murderous monster or a granny that leads you astray. And that's the best part of the series. It just doesn't take itself seriously at all, and not in a cringy Borderlands way, but in an adult, mature, violent, yet very funny and entertaining, wild sort of way. And on top of that too, the combat and turn-based mechanics are all super well thought out, tactical, and fun. Throwing grenades at heaps of enemies and watching blood and limbs fly, or shooting electricity at a robot to shut it down for a turn never gets old. And especially in some of the higher difficulties in late game fights, things can actually get really hectic and you will have to use everything in your arsenal and at your disposal to achieve victory. But more than all that, the game just excels so much on that first playthrough because of the super strong tone. It really feels like a video game that was made first and foremost to be about fun, not some super serious sad family matters or precise gunplay, but rather an environment to just play around with, characters that will make you laugh, and encounters so unbelievable and weird you just won't be able to get the same experience anywhere else, even Fallout. In fact, I'd argue this game might be the best entry point into the CRPG genre out of anything there because of just how approachable it is. Far and away, Baldur's Baldur's Gate 3 and Wasteland 3 are my favorite in the entire genre, which is home to so many greats, and I think that's because just like Baldur's Gate 3, Wasteland 3 perfectly understands what it was trying to do and executes it in such a great way. A playthrough that the first time around will without a doubt be a blast for almost anyone, especially if you go into co-op with friends. The Dyson Sphere program is the most fun I've had in a simulation game probably ever. You see, I've always been a fan of things like SimCity, Roller Coaster or Zoo Tycoon, and even the more hardcore experiences like Factorio. And more than any other hardcore simulation experience out there, Dyson Sphere program or DSP just manages to scratch an itch that almost no games even try to. At the start of each playthrough, you land on a planet in a massive galaxy you can explore and must start trying to research upgrades in order to eventually travel to more planets, all in an attempt to build a massive Dyson sphere around a sun. And in order to do so, you have to extract and develop as many resources as possible from each planet, starting from humble beginnings as one robot with no blueprints, all the way to a massive spacefaring civilization with automated supply lines and turret defenses. It has the depth and complexity of the most hardcore games in the genre, but also with a much more user-friendly UI, as well as graphics that actually are beautiful and interesting to look at. The real thing though that makes this game so great on that first playthrough is just how satisfying it is to figure things out and improve upon them without any prior knowledge. I spent countless hours doing nothing more than automating my supply lines, seeing where I have a slowdown, and figuring out ways to improve my setup. It's one of the most addicting gameplay loops I've ever seen in my entire life, where there is always something to improve, something new to build or research, or a new way to make things more efficient. And because of the style of game and the gameplay, a lot of people wouldn't even give this game a shot, but it truly will suck you in once you start to get into the groove of making your setup as good as possible. There really is just something so fun about creating miles and miles of conveyor belts, pushing thousands of pounds of items and materials across a planet into different refineries and science facilities that all are helping you to reach the next step of your evolution. You have to account for the speed at which each belt is moving in relation to swappers that move materials across distances, and compare that to the speed at which your refineries and research stations are working, trying to create a perfectly harmonious balance that just feels so satisfying when you pull it off, while also being lenient enough that it all still works even for beginners, albeit much less efficiently. And now that the game has been in early access for some time, there's so many interesting mechanics and things to do that the perfectionist side to all of us will always have something to look into. And really, more than anything, Dyson Sphere program is just the type of game that is so unique and special. There isn't anything else out there quite like it, and even for those of you who aren't into games like this, it finally is approachable and easy enough to just get into, and it's not almost impossible trying to just figure everything out. It's just fun. One of those first playthroughs where not looking at tutorials and watching countless videos can make it better as you just figure out solutions on your own and tackle situations in ways you initially didn't even think of. In a way, it's all one big puzzle that needs to be figured out, and because of the fantastic scale and presentation of everything, it makes that first playthrough such an amazing and awesome one that I highly recommend for anyone out there that even thinks this looks remotely cool. And speaking of games that unravel like a puzzle, why not take a look at one of the best puzzle games out there that really left a first impression on me? And that's because Talos Principle 2 and even its first iteration are some of the most underrated games out there. Just like most puzzle games, they focus on the challenge, and here they tend to be better than a lot of other games in the genre I've tried in the sense of how they make you think. There are more obstacles with spatial reasoning as opposed to purely pressing buttons in a certain order, and especially in the second game, new mechanics are constantly being introduced in every new zone, and they change how you tackle every objective. To me though, what makes the Talos Principle series so great on that first playthrough is also its huge focus on philosophy. While Portal is more fun and approachable with a much better story and world, and while The Witness has a special place all to its own, the Talos Principle just hits so many things I love to see in games too. Not only do you get the great puzzles that feel satisfying to finish, but also dispersed in each area are tons of logs or discussions you can have with other robotic characters that dive into the great questions from so many of the world's best philosophers through time, touching on queries of what even is intelligence, is power irresponsible to hold, and what even makes us human in the first place. And that first playthrough of this game is so great specifically because not only do you not have the context of how the puzzles work yet, meaning they provide a greater challenge and thus feel more satisfying and rewarding, but also those philosophical themes, especially in conjunction with the ending, all tie together nicely. Even the environments in the second game look great with Unreal Unreal Engine 5, and most impressively, this game, despite being about puzzles, has some of the most varied and also grand in scale locations I've seen in a long time. You will look out over vast snowy mountain ranges where you can descend all the way towards the sea, or sprawling deserts that stretch for miles in each direction with hidden oases in the middle, or even vast megastructures full of futuristic tech and architecture. So along with the whimsical soundtrack, there's just a nice trance you get into while playing this game, just exploring and finding puzzles, which you feel so good after figuring out after all that time. And again, the best part is how it all just comes together with the philosophy as well, meaning you will not only be thinking from a challenge perspective trying to solve puzzles, but also from a philosophical one, where you will be thinking about life and its meaning while traveling from one challenge to the next. And honestly, while the game has so many faults like mediocre writing and suspect pacing at points, the core of what it aims to achieve is so great. A beautiful world with a rich history that is so full of lore and philosophy that will make you think, and puzzles that will challenge your brain. And it's a shame that these games aren't more beloved, because despite puzzle games being such a niche genre, just like Portal did years ago, the Talos Principle 2 is a great entry point that almost anyone could enjoy if they gave it a chance. And it's also a blueprint for potentially a third game that might finally realize the AAA puzzle game vision of amazing design, world, gameplay, and story. So do yourself a favor and give this game a shot, because that first playthrough of figuring out each puzzle and unraveling the philosophy and mystery behind the main story is really something almost no other games have tried, and I think you'll love it. As I already mentioned earlier in this video, Prey from Arcane Studios is one of the greatest games ever made, and yet so few people talk about it or have even tried it. And sadly, that failure at Arcane eventually resulted in the studio head, along with many other members, leaving the team and founding a new studio called Wolfeye, whose first game just so happened to be another absolutely amazing journey to experience that first go-around. Because that game, otherwise known as Weird West, is all about crafting an experience focused on interactivity and emergent storytelling. The game takes place in the Wild West, but with many strange twists involving the paranormal and unnatural. And throughout the runtime, you take charge of 5 different characters, including a sheriff, Native American, and even a walking pigman monstrosity. And in each of these 5 character sections, you get to make multiple big decisions that will drastically affect the world, quite literally changing entire future sections of the game you will see on subsequent characters. But while this is all cool, the real triumph of Weird West is how it manages to make such an engaging gameplay loop in each of these campaigns. Built as an immersive sim from the ground up, each item or weapon in-game can serve multiple purposes. You are able to upgrade your character in a variety of ways, allowing things like jumping to ledges that were too high before, or turning invisible mid-combat to pull off heists without a trace. And whereas most immersive sim games focus on first-person action or over-the-shoulder third-person, Weird West actually pulls the camera back even more, which, while it's less immersive, actually provides a special sense of being more tactical as well. In each of the campaigns too, you will get special powers and access to certain locations, and everything you do in previous parts of the game will affect what happens in the future. You can even meet your previous characters you played as a new character, and then recruit them to your team to fight for you, all while talking about how you both are a part of something bigger. When you shoot bandits out on a mission, sometimes their family members will find you later in game and come back for vengeance, or if you help characters, they may come to your aid later down the line. Really though, what makes the first playthrough so good is that everything about this game is so systems based. I'm a sucker for immersive sims, as I already mentioned, for this very reason, and Weird West does such a good job at making every system in the game interact with each other in such interesting ways, along with having an intriguing story that drastically changes based on what you do with each character and how they interact with one another. It's another example of a game that still has a fair share of flaws, but the fact that it's coming from a brand new studio is a huge testament, and it's laying the groundwork for what I think may be one of the most underrated studios in the coming years if they play their cards right. And just like many of the other games on this list, it excels on that first playthrough because it's wholly unique to itself while still capitalizing on the vision in a very fun way.